Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
The 1960s, right? Just a total whirlwind of change and upheaval. And you know what? It feels like their impact is still with us. So today we are diving deep into the heart of that era, the New Left movement.
Okay, sounds good.
And our guide for this deep dive is this awesome episode from Mr. Hutchings History called 7.172 The New Left, Promise, Protest, and Paradox in 1960s America.
Catchy title.
I know, right? So we're basically going back to school on this one. Where did the movement come from? What did it actually accomplish? And why should we still care about it now, decades later?
Well, one of the things that strikes me is how the New Left really emerges from this very specific historical moment. Like, you have this whole generation coming of age in the shadow of the Cold War.
Yeah.
They're living with this, constant threat of nuclear annihilation. And at the same time, they're witnessing the fight for civil rights gaining momentum.
Right.
So they start to see this gap, this, disconnect between the American ideals they've been taught and the reality they're seeing all around them.
It's like they were given this picture-perfect image of post-war America, but then they start to see, oh, wait a minute, there's a lot going on beneath the surface.
Exactly.
And it's not just surface stuff. We're talking about really deep systemic issues like inequality, militarism.
Right.
And the podcast mentions the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, formed in 1960, playing a key role. And then they released the Port Huron Statement in 1962, like their big manifesto, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the Port Huron Statement was hugely influential. It really lays out all these inequalities that are plaguing American society, particularly racial disparities.
Uh-huh.
And they also condemned the Cold War and this constant threat of violence, especially, the growing power of what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex.
Okay, so for those of us who maybe slept through that part of history class, what exactly was the military-industrial complex?
So imagine, right, you have the military and all the industries that support it, like the companies making weapons, the defense contractors. They all become so intertwined, and they start to have this outsized influence on government policy.
I see.
So they are constantly pushing for more military spending, even if it's not in the best interest of, everyday people.
Right, right. So they're kind of calling out this whole system that's perpetuating war, basically.
Yeah.
So they're not messing around with small stuff here. And the podcast also mentions this term, participatory democracy. And I get that they wanted people to be more active in their communities, but what did that actually look like in practice?
Basically, they wanted to shift power away from those traditional institutions, like the government,
Yes.
right? And put it more in the hands of everyday people.
Okay.
So think grassroots organizing, community councils, directly having a say in the decisions that affect their lives.
I can see how that would be appealing, especially for young people who feel like those institutions aren't listening to them.
Absolutely.
And speaking of not listening, the podcast mentions a growing distrust of, well, pretty much everyone. Universities, corporations, the government.
Yeah, there was this feeling that these big institutions were part of the problem, not the solution. Like they were the ones perpetuating all these inequalities.
Gotcha.
So it wasn't just about changing a policy here or there. They wanted to change the whole system.
Big goals. And the podcast points to this 1965 anti-war demonstration in Washington, D.C., led by SDS as this big turning point. Now, when I think about the 60s, I always associate it with, the peace and love vibes. So how did these kind of seemingly conflicting ideas coexist within the New Left?
Well, it's important to remember that the counterculture and the New Left, while they overlapped a lot, they weren't exactly the same thing.
Okay.
The counterculture was more focused on personal liberation, alternative lifestyles, things like that, whereas the New Left was always focused on these concrete political objectives.
So you could have someone who's all about peace and love, but not really interested in dismantling the military-industrial complex.
Exactly.
Huh, that's interesting.
And that distinction actually led to tension within the movement. Think about organized labor. Unions were fighting for workers' rights, but a lot of them were really turned off by the counterculture's focus on, hedonism and things like that.
I see. So potential allies who might have supported those core political goals were kind of put off by the way the counterculture was presenting things.
Right.
That makes sense. And the podcast mentions that by 1968, the New Left itself starts to splinter into these different factions. And I'm curious about those different groups. What were they like?
Well, you had a whole spectrum, right? Some groups were all about direct action. Others were more focused on community organizing. For example, you have the Yippies.
The Yippies.
Yeah, the Youth International Party, they were all about theatrical protests and using humor, almost like absurdity, to challenge authority.
Okay.
They were famous for their antics at the 1968 Democratic National Convention, where they nominated a pig for president.
Whoa, that definitely got people's attention.
Oh, yeah.
What about some of the other groups?
You also had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which was taking a more, let's say, militant approach to African-American activism.
Okay.
They were frustrated with the slow pace of change and believed in self-defense against racial violence. Their slogan was Black Power.
So even within this movement that's broadly about, social justice and change, you have these really different approaches. And were these divisions partly because they couldn't agree on the best way to achieve their goals?
Absolutely. And these differences, they really come to a head at this event called the 1967 National Conference for New Politics in Chicago. And the podcast talks about how racial tensions within the movement really kind of boiled over at this conference. It revealed all these deep divisions and disagreements about priorities and strategies.
That's a great illustration of how hard it can be to keep a movement unified, especially when it's as diverse and passionate as the New Left was. And I'm guessing these tensions didn't just disappear overnight, right?
No, they definitely had consequences.
Yes.
As certain factions became more and more radical, they started alienating, a lot of people, including potential allies. There's this group called the Weathermen, a splinter group from SDS.
Yeah.
They started engaging in these violent protests. And that really hurt the credibility of the broader movement. It made it harder to get their message across.
Yeah, I can see how that would backfire. So now we've got this movement that's dealing with these major internal struggles and also facing backlash for the actions of some of its most radical members. Did this ultimately lead to its decline?
I think it definitely played a role, but it's also important to remember that the New Left wasn't this monolithic entity. I mean, it was incredibly diverse. And that diversity led to a lot of different interpretations of its significance and impact. Actually, the podcast mentions 4 main schools of thought: progressive, Marxist, conservative, and intersectional.
Ooh, I am really interested to hear how these different perspectives view the movement. Maybe we can unpack them one by one. What about the progressive historians? How do they see things?
And progressive historians, they tend to view the New Left as this catalyst for positive change. They really emphasize its role in pushing forward social justice movements, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement.
Yeah.
They highlight its success in raising awareness about systemic inequality, and challenging America's actions abroad, calling out its imperialism.
So from their perspective, the New Left's legacy is largely a positive one. They might acknowledge the struggles, but they're ultimately focusing on its role in advancing these really important social causes. What about the Marxist perspective? How do they view things?
The Marxist historians, they take a bit more of a, let's say, nuanced view. They acknowledge that the New Left challenged capitalism, right?
Yeah.
They exposed its contradictions, but they also kind of critiqued the movement's lack of a clear class-based strategy.
Mm-hmm.
They argue that its focus on identity politics and this decentralized way of organizing may have actually been a missed opportunity for building a more unified working class movement, one that could actually dismantle capitalist structures.
That's fascinating. So it's not just a simple thumbs up or thumbs down, right? They're seeing both the potential and the limitations of the New Left's approach, taking into account all those complexities. What about the conservative perspective? What do they have to say?
Conservative historians, as you might expect, tend to offer a more critical view of the New Left. They argue that the movement's rejection of traditional values and institutions, it really led to social instability. It undermined the fabric of American society. A good example of this perspective is Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind. He argues that the New Left fostered a culture of relativism and that it really eroded the intellectual standards of universities.
That's an interesting point, but I guess you could also argue that challenging traditional values can be a good thing, right? Especially if those values are rooted in racism or sexism or other forms of oppression.
Absolutely. And that's where the intersectional perspective comes in.
Okay.
Intersectional historians, they acknowledge the New Left's contributions to racial justice, feminism, LGBTQ plus rights, but they also critique the movement's failure to fully integrate those causes, to create this truly intersectional framework that really addresses these interlocking systems of oppression.
Makes sense.
They highlight the difficulty of building coalitions across different identity groups And they point out how certain forms of privilege within the movement sometimes overshadowed the needs of more marginalized voices.
So we have all these different interpretations, each offering a unique lens through which to view the New Left. It's a good reminder that history is messy and there's rarely one right answer. But maybe we can shift gears a bit and delve into some specific events and individuals that the podcast highlights.
Okay, yeah, sounds good.
We've got the 1965 anti-war demonstration in Washington, the 1968 Columbia University protests, and the 1968 Democratic National Convention. These events just capture the energy, the chaos, and the drama of the era.
They really do. And it's important to remember that these events weren't just isolated protests. They were moments that really shaped public discourse and exposed these deep divisions within American society. Like take the 1965 anti-war demonstration, for example.
Yeah.
That was a watershed moment for the anti-war movement. It showed just how much power the New Left was gaining and its ability to mobilize massive opposition to the Vietnam War.
And then you have the 1968 Columbia University protests. And those were about so much more than just the Vietnam War, right? They were also about racial inequality, the university's role in these systems of oppression.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, those protests were actually sparked by this plan to build a gym.
That's right, a gym in a nearby park. And the gym project, it became this symbol of the university's disregard for the surrounding black community. Like, the gym was going to be built on public land, which was largely used by black residents. And the university's plans, they included separate entrances for students and Harlem residents.
Oh, wow.
Which was seen as, blatant segregation.
Yeah.
But the protests, which involved student occupations in these clashes with the police, they actually forced the university to abandon the gym project.
Wow.
And they also ended up cutting ties with the Institute for Defense Analyses, which was this military research group.
So those protests actually had tangible results? They weren't just symbolic. They forced the university to change its policies and actions. That's impressive.
It really is.
Okay, so what about the 1968 Democratic National Convention? I know the Yippies were involved, and I'm picturing just total mayhem, colorful protests, the whole bit. Am I right?
You're not wrong. The Yippies, with their, let's say, unique brand of activism,
Yeah.
they descended on Chicago with the goal of disrupting the convention and exposing the hypocrisy of the Democratic Party.
Okay.
They nominated Pegasus, a pig, for president.
Oh my gosh.
And they staged this festival of life in the streets of Chicago, which quickly turned into a violent confrontation with the police.
Wow, so it sounds like those protests were more about spectacle and disruption than achieving specific policy goals. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. The Yippies were less interested in working within the system and more interested in exposing its flaws. They used humor and satire and street theater to really challenge authority, to provoke a reaction. And the resulting clashes between protesters and the police, which were, all over the news at the time,
Of course.
they became known as the police riot. And they really tarnished the image of the Democratic Party and the entire political establishment for that matter.
So these events paint this really vivid picture, right, of the era, like the passion, the anger, the desire for change, but also the escalating tensions and the challenges of channeling all that energy into lasting change. So looking back, what's the lasting legacy of the New Left? What are the key takeaways for us today?
That's the big question, isn't it? The legacy of the New Left is complicated, multifaceted. It's a story of incredible activism, of challenging authority, of raising awareness about inequality and injustice. It's a movement that inspired countless other movements for social change, everything from environmentalism to feminism to LGBTQ plus rights.
Wow, so its influence is still felt in a lot of contemporary activism. Like you can draw a line from the New Left to things like Black Lives Matter or the fight for climate justice.
Absolutely. The New Left showed just how powerful grassroots organizing can be. The power of participatory democracy, of speaking truth to power. It changed how we think about social change and the role of citizens in shaping their own destinies. But we also have to acknowledge that the New Left struggled too. There were internal divisions, questions about strategy, and, just the sheer difficulty of translating ideals into concrete, lasting change.
So it's not a simple story of just triumph. We have to look at the movement's shortcomings too.
Right, exactly. The New Left reminds us that movements for social change are inherently messy and complicated, full of contradictions. There are triumphs and setbacks, moments of unity and moments of fragmentation.
Yeah, it's like trying to build a plane while you're flying it, right? Figuring things out on the fly, new challenges popping up all the time.
That's a great analogy. And that's why it's so important to study movements like the New Left, not just to understand the past, but to learn from both the successes and the failures as we navigate the challenges we face today.
So to sum it all up, it seems like the New Left's legacy is this multifaceted thing. It's about passionate activism, about challenging authority, about raising awareness about inequality, but it's also about the internal divisions, the difficulties of turning ideals into real, lasting, systemic change.
That's a great summary, and it really leaves us with a lot to think about. Like, how can we learn from the New Left's success in mobilizing people? How can we avoid those pitfalls, the fragmentation, the radicalization that ultimately contributed to its decline?
Those are questions worth thinking about, especially for anyone involved in social movements and activism today. So to our listeners, as you continue engaging with the issues that matter to you, think about the legacy of the New Left. What resonates with you? What lessons can you take away from their experience? And how can you apply those lessons as we work to build a more just and equitable world?
I think that's a great question to leave our listeners with. The New Left might be history, but its impact and those questions it raised about power, justice, social change, they're still with us today.
Exactly. And that's why we wanted to take this deep dive. So stick with us for part 2, where we'll delve deeper into the New Left's influence and impact. We'll be back after a quick break.
So we left off talking about how the New Left wasn't this one big unified thing and how all these different interpretations emerged about like what it all meant.
Right, exactly.
And you mentioned like 4 main schools of thought: progressive, Marxist, conservative, and intersectional.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more about how each of those perspectives views the New Left.
Okay, sure. So let's start with the progressives.
For them, the New Left is really seen as this force for positive change, a catalyst.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they emphasize its role in all the major social justice movements, like the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement.
Right.
They point to its success in, raising awareness about all the inequality in the system.
Right.
And challenging America's actions on the world stage, its imperialism.
So essentially they're saying, yeah, there were internal struggles and all that, but ultimately the New Left played a big role in advancing these super important causes.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. What about from the Marxist perspective? What's their take?
Well, the Marxist historians take a slightly more, I guess you could say, nuanced view.
Okay.
They acknowledge that, yeah, the New Left challenged capitalism, exposed all those inherent contradictions.
Mm-hmm.
But they also critique its lack of a clear strategy, a class-based strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Their argument is that the focus on identity politics and this kind of decentralized way of organizing might have actually been a missed opportunity. Like, they could have built a much more powerful, unified working class movement that could truly, take down those capitalist structures.
That's really interesting. So it's not just a simple yay or nay. They see both the good and the bad, the potential and, I guess, the missed opportunities.
Right. It's all about context.
Okay, so what about the conservative perspective then?
Well, the conservative historians, not surprisingly, offer a much more critical view.
Right.
They argue that the New Left and its rejection of those traditional values and institutions ultimately led to instability, to a breakdown of the social fabric.
Mm-hmm.
And they point to, like, Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind, as a classic example of this viewpoint. Bloom's whole argument was that the New Left fostered this culture of relativism, where, anything goes. And that really eroded the intellectual standards of universities, the whole system.
I see what they're saying, but I guess I would push back a bit on that. Like, isn't challenging those traditional values sometimes necessary?
Oh, absolutely.
Especially when those values are rooted in things like racism and sexism and other forms of oppression, right?
Exactly. And that's where the intersectional perspective comes in.
Okay, I'm really curious to hear about this one.
The intersectional historians, they acknowledge the New Left's contributions to all the important movements, right? Racial justice, feminism, LGBTQ rights, you name it.
Yeah.
But they also critique the fact that those causes weren't always fully integrated, Like, the movement didn't always operate from this truly intersectional framework that acknowledged how these systems of oppression really connect and overlap.
That's a great point. I can see how that would be a limitation.
Right. And they point to those difficulties in building coalitions between all these different groups, different identities. And they also talk about how certain forms of privilege within the movement itself sometimes overshadowed the needs of those who are more marginalized.
So it seems like each of these historical interpretations gives us a different lens to look through. It's a good reminder that history is messy and there isn't always one clear answer.
Exactly.
But maybe we can shift gears a bit now. We keep talking about all these huge, complex ideas and different interpretations. I'd love to hear about some specific events and individuals that the podcast highlights, to kind of bring this all to life a bit.
Okay, sure.
The podcast mentioned the 1965 anti-war demonstration in Washington, the 1968 Columbia University protests, and the 1968 Democratic National Convention. Those events seem like they really capture the energy and, I guess, the turmoil of the era.
Definitely. And it's important to remember, those events weren't just isolated protests. There were these moments that shaped the public conversation and really exposed the fault lines in American society. Like, take the 1965 anti-war demonstration. That was a defining moment for the anti-war movement.
Yeah.
It really showed the growing power of the New Left and its ability to bring people together and oppose the Vietnam War.
It's amazing to think about how much influence they had. What about the Columbia University protests in '68? Those were about so much more than the Vietnam War, weren't they? Like, there were also issues of racial inequality, the university's role in oppressive systems.
Exactly. Those protests were sparked by a plan to build a gym.
A gym.
Yeah, a gym in a park near the university. And that project became this symbol of the university's disregard for the surrounding Black community.
Wow.
I mean, the gym was going to be built on public land, which is mostly used by Black residents.
Right.
And the plans included separate entrances for students and Harlem residents.
Oh, wow. That's just...
Yeah, it was seen as straight-up segregation.
Right.
But the protests, which involved, students occupying buildings, clashing with the police,
Yeah.
they actually forced the university to back down. They abandoned the gym project completely.
Wow.
And they also cut ties with this group called the Institute for Defense Analyses, which was doing all this military research.
So those protests actually had tangible results.
They did. They weren't just symbolic. They actually forced the university to change its policies and its actions.
That's really impressive.
Yeah.
Okay, so last but not least, what about the 1968 Democratic National Convention? I know the Yippies were involved, and I have this image in my head of just pure chaos and crazy protests.
You're not far off. The Yippies, with their, shall we say, unique style.
Yeah, I remember them.
They decided to descend on Chicago to disrupt the convention and, expose all the hypocrisy of the Democratic Party. They nominated Pegasus, who was a pig, for president.
Okay, now that is theatrical.
It was. They also staged this festival of life in the streets, which predictably, I guess, turned into a violent confrontation with the police.
So it sounds like those protests were less about achieving specific goals and more about just making a statement, creating a spectacle.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. The Yippies weren't really interested in working within the system. They were more about, exposing its flaws, poking fun at it. They used humor, satire, all that to really provoke a reaction. Right. And the clashes that happened between the protesters and the police, which were broadcast everywhere at the time, became known as the police riot and really damaged the image of the Democratic Party and, the establishment in general.
So it seems like all these events really paint a picture of the times. You have the passion, the desire for change, but also this escalating tension, the struggle to turn those big ideals into real lasting change. So when we look back now, what's the lasting legacy of the New Left? What should we be taking away from all of this?
That's the million-dollar question, right? The New Left's legacy is really complex. It's a story of incredible activism, of people standing up to power, raising awareness about inequality, injustice, and it inspired so many other movements for social change. Environmentalism, feminism, LGBTQ rights. I mean, the list goes on.
So you're saying it didn't just disappear, its influence continued even after the 60s were over.
Exactly.
Like, we can draw a line from the New Left to what we see happening today with movements like Black Lives Matter or the fight for climate justice.
Absolutely. I mean, the New Left showed just how powerful grassroots organizing can be. The power of people getting involved, participating in democracy, speaking truth to power. They changed how we think about social change.
Yeah.
But we also can't forget that the New Left struggled too, right? They had their own internal division, disagreements about the best way to do things.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to translate those big ideals into real, concrete change that lasts.
So it's not a simple success story, right?
Yeah.
There are also lessons to be learned from the things that didn't work so well.
Definitely. The New Left reminds us that movements for change are messy. They're complicated. There are going to be contradictions, victories, setbacks. There will be moments of unity and moments of, well, just total chaos.
It's like what we were saying before about building a plane in midair.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to study these movements, not just to understand the past,
Yeah.
but to learn those lessons, the good and the bad.
Right, and apply those lessons to the challenges we face today. So, to kind of sum it all up, the New Left's legacy is complicated. It's a story of passion, activism, standing up to power, but also of those internal struggles, the difficulty of achieving lasting change.
That's a great way to put it.
Hmm.
And it leaves us with a lot to think about. How can we learn from what they did well? How can we avoid the mistakes, the things that tore them apart?
These are definitely questions worth considering for anyone who's involved in activism and trying to make a difference. So, to all our listeners out there, as you continue engaging with the issues you care about, think about the New Left. What resonates with you? What lessons can you take away? How can you apply what you've learned to make the world a better place?
I think that's a great point to leave on. The New Left might be history, but it still has a lot to teach us.
You know, it's funny when you think about it, it's easy to kind of just assume that the New Left just sort of like faded away.
Yeah.
But you're saying it wasn't that simple.
No, not really. Like, faded away doesn't quite capture it. I think it's more accurate to say that it kind of transformed. Like, all that energy, it didn't just vanish. It went in different directions, fueling other movements. And honestly, it's still shaping our world today in ways we probably don't even realize.
So how do we make sense of that then? You have this explosion of energy, all this idealism, and then...
Things fall apart.
Yeah. It seems like a paradox.
Well, that's kind of the whole story of the New Left, right?
Yeah.
Paradox.
Yeah.
They were driven by this belief that they could really change the world, make it better, and they achieved a lot, you know? They shifted the conversation, inspired lasting change. But that big goal, that lasting systemic change, well, that proved to be much harder.
Right.
I mean, part of it was just the historical context, right? The Vietnam War, the Cold War. There was so much going on.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of pushback against the changes they were trying to bring about. But there were also all those internal challenges, the disagreements about strategy, leadership issues.
Trying to build these coalitions, keep them together when everyone's got such strong opinions.
It makes you wonder if any movement can really escape those kinds of challenges, like when you have all these passionate people coming together, wanting to change things.
It's going to get messy.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the big lessons we can learn from the New Left. These movements, they're inherently messy. They're full of contradictions, moments of success, and then huge setbacks. It's all part of the process. I think the key is learning from those challenges, being willing to adapt, to change, but always keeping that end goal in sight.
So what does all of this mean for us now? Like, what can we learn from the New Left's experience, those of us who are, still fighting for social justice? Well, there are a ton of lessons, both good and bad.
Yeah.
I think we can look at what they did well, mobilizing people, challenging those in power, really raising awareness. And there's a lot to be inspired by, their courage, their passion. But we also need to look at where things went wrong, the dangers of infighting, the importance of finding common ground, building coalitions that are truly inclusive, and having a plan, a long-term vision.
So it's not just about copying what they did, right? It's more about understanding those bigger dynamics and figuring out how to apply those lessons now.
Right.
It's about understanding that this work, fighting for justice, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah, it takes a lot of resilience, and a willingness to change, to collaborate, to learn from each other.
Absolutely.
And honestly, I think the most important thing the New Left reminds us of is that change
Yeah.
says possible. They didn't achieve all their goals, but they changed America. They expanded what people thought was possible, and they inspired so many others to keep fighting.
It's incredible when you think about it. Their impact is still felt today. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge. Think about everything we've discussed. What resonates with you? What lessons can you take away from the New Left's experience? And how can you use those lessons in your own life, in your own work, to make the world a little bit better? The fight for justice continues, and hopefully their story can give us all a little bit of hope and guidance along the way. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.